let us talk about the Corinthians. Now, Paul went to the Corinthian saints in his second missionary journey. That's when he first preached in Corinth. This missionary journey began in the late 40s, probably in 48 or 49. Goes through Galatia up into northern Greece with Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and then he comes down to Athens and over to Corinth. He stays a year and a half in Corinth. This would have been somewhere between the years of 50 and 52. That's when he's in Corinth and where he writes his epistles to the Thessalonians, which we have already read. Now, this missionary journey is recorded in the first half of Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 17. When he leaves Corinth, he returns to Antioch. First, a brief stop in Ephesus, and then to Jerusalem to give his report, and then back up to Antioch, which is where he is based out of for his missionary journeys. In chapter 19, he starts his third missionary journey. This time he again travels through Galatia and into Ephesus on the west coast. Now, I have said in previous videos that Asia is kind of the term for what we call Asia Minor, but that's not entirely accurate. The central part of Asia Minor today would be Galatia of the ancient days. The northern part is Bithynia. Asia is actually referenced to the west coast of what we now call Asia Minor. So when in chapter 19 we read that from Ephesus the gospel spread to all of Asia, it's not talking about the whole section of Asia Minor, it's talking about this west coast area. Ephesus is the center of the church in Asia. It's kind of like the stake center. And from here, he writes his letters to the Corinthians, or at least he begins to write his letters to the Corinthians. Now here's the thing we got to understand first, before we talk about the two epistles we have, is that these are not the only epistles that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. What we have today as the first epistle to the Corinthians is actually his second, which we read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. In 2 Corinthians, he also makes reference to another epistle, but he talks about it as kind of an epistle of woe, an epistle of tears, epistle of causing him anxiety over the church in Corinth, which is not characteristic of what we call 1 Corinthians. And so it is believed by scholars that he wrote 4 epistles, at least, where we have one epistle written before 1 Corinthians, then we get 1 Corinthians, then we get what is now called the Epistle of Tears, and then we have what we call 2 Corinthians. There is another book known as 3 Corinthians, but is generally rejected by scholars as a fabrication, not written by Paul, and it is not in the scriptures. So, when did he write these 2 epistles? Did he write them in Antioch before he went over to Ephesus? Did he write them in Ephesus? When were these epistles written? This is the basic timeline of events that I've been able to find, and it generally makes sense, and so it's probably true. This is a scholarly timeline written out to show what the consensus is on the timeline of these epistles. So again, he was in Corinth for a year and a half, between the years 50 and 52. He then returns to Antioch. He then later goes on his third missionary journey, where he stops off in Ephesus for just under 3 years. We know he was there for at least 2.5 years, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 years. This would have been between the years of 53 and 57, depending on exactly when he was in Corinth. We're not quite sure. There's a little bit of a leeway there, a little bit of wiggle room as to exactly when this was. But it is in his first year in Ephesus that is believed that he writes his first epistle, which is known as the Epistle of Warning. We aren't told what it is. We have no idea what it is. We are told that he wrote it and that there was some kind of warning in it. Other than that, we don't know anything about this epistle, why it was written or what. It's just there was an epistle there. In the second year that he is in Ephesus, he writes his second epistle to the Corinthians. And that is what we have today as the first epistle to the Corinthians. A little confusing, I know. This one is written in response to several things. There are those of Chloe. We don't really know who Chloe is, but there's reference to the people of Chloe in the epistle that he is responding to. There's also, he talks about a letter sent from the Corinthians to him, asking him questions, which he is also responding to. There is also the report of Apollos, because Apollos, remember, after he was taught by Priscilla and Aquila, he went to Greece and eventually to Corinth, and he has brought back his report to Paul, and Paul is responding to some things that he has said. So we have various things going on, various sources of information that Paul has been receiving, and he is responding to in what we have as the first epistle to the Corinthians. Now, sometime after writing this epistle, he makes a brief visit into Greece and visits Corinth. This is not mentioned in Acts, and so we assume it was a very brief visit, a week or two, maybe 3. It is during his stay in Ephesus. So he's in Ephesus for 2.5 to 3 years. Sometime after writing his second epistle, he travels to Corinth. He sees the state of the church there. He returns to Ephesus. And then he writes his third epistle, what we now call the Epistle of Tears, or the Epistle of Woe, where he is apparently kind of lamenting the state of the church in Corinth. Now, we don't have this epistle, and this epistle is more speculative. He doesn't directly state that he wrote this exactly. Well, he says he wrote about it, but we don't know if what he's making reference to exactly. So it would be at this time that he writes this third epistle. After his stay in Ephesus, he then travels into northern Greece or Macedonia, from where he writes what we have as the second epistle to the Corinthians. Shortly thereafter, he returns to Corinth, visits them for a short time before again returning to Jerusalem. So that is our timeline for the epistles to the Corinthians. He comes to Ephesus, he writes his first epistle. He then gets word from Apollos, he gets a letter from the Corinthians, and he responds with his second epistle, what we call 1 Corinthians. Near sometime during his stay in Ephesus, he makes a brief visit to Corinth. Returning, writes a third epistle as a lament of the state of the church. He then makes a journey into Greece and writes what we have as 2 Corinthians before making a final visit to Corinth and returning to Jerusalem. That's the timeline. But what about the scholarly opinions on these epistles? Once again, there's no real dispute over who wrote these two letters. The epistles to the Corinthians are agreed by everybody to have been written by Paul, which is good. Prophets have confirmed this. But there are some ideas that portions of it were added by later scribes. Specifically in 1 Corinthians, the reference that women should not speak in church. That is thought to be a later addition. Partly because on some early manuscripts it is written in the margins and not as part of the main body of the letter. So some people say, well, that was a later scribe writing this in, but others say, well, no, that was Paul writing it in the margins to clarify his meaning after he got to Corinth. So there's some dispute there. For 2 Corinthians, there is the theory that it actually is composed of 2 or 3 different letters being put together by later scribes, that Paul wrote 5 or 6 letters to the Corinthians, and that later scribes took these shorter letters and combined them all together into one. Personally, on this one, I don't think the speculation of later scribal interpolation on 1 Corinthians is true, because if it was, I think Joseph Smith would have just removed those verses when he did the Joseph Smith translation, and he doesn't, he just corrects them. However, with 2 Corinthians being 2 or 3 different letters combined together, some people even say that what is known as the letter of tears is part of 2 Corinthians that we have today. It's possible. I don't think that the Joseph Smith translation would have necessarily broken it up into different books, but it's all speculation, and it doesn't really matter. It would still all be written by Paul. On a few final notes, the main purpose of the first epistle is to address various controversies and questions that have arisen in Corinth. We aren't necessarily told what these controversies are, but there are definitely some over resurrection, over marriage, various topics that are addressed in the epistle. We are not told what specific questions were being asked, but we do know some of the issues that were being addressed. In the second epistle, this is more of a defense that Paul makes against attacks being made on him. After he writes the letter of tears, a lot of people are criticizing him and attacking him personally for his neglect of the church, for his overbearing letters and everything, and he's writing this epistle in a personal defense against these slanders. So now, let us read the epistles to the Corinthians.